scientist, it was interesting that this field is opening up pretty rapidly, and a lot of the folks around here were a little nervous about feeling like they were, anybody was an expert in the area, but one of our faculty members pointed us to Andy. Andy Novak is with us today, and he is an MD PhD candidate who has some experience and interest in the area, and he assures us that he's not an expert, but will lead us through some wonderful things. Andy is from Philadelphia and went undergrad at Philadelphia School of Pharmacy and is now here doing an MD PhD and has worked with some folks in this area and is willing to take us on a little journey to see if he can educate us enough to know even what neuroscience is. So if you could define it at the end of the night, that's going to be a good thing for that. So we're glad you're here, and Andy, thank you so much for being with us, and we're all yours. Oh, and I did promise him that we were sort of an in-house group here, and that we're playful, and we would be that we laugh more the more we drink. So that's good. Thanks. Welcome.
So, right, I'm going to try to give a little bit of an introduction to neuroscience in general, and particularly this new field or this new interest that some neuroscientists are daring to take on, which is this neuroscience of consciousness and the self, and it should really be known that. Similar to what Steve found when he was looking for faculty members, neuroscientists in general are very, they don't like to attack this stuff. They really like to keep things, there was an article that I came across that's called, "There is no such thing as a non-materialist neuroscience." And basically what that means is that, like, anything that's like beyond the realm of stuff that we can put our hands on and view, we just don't do. So that's just to give you an idea of where the science still is to it. But there are some interesting individuals and some interesting research that's coming out that's sort of crossing the border from this materialist science and giving us some insight into what it means for sort of subjective experience in mental life. So I thought I'd start with a little exercise to introduce you to what neuroscience can tell us and what neuroscientists do. For this exercise, it's really useful if you have a drink. It doesn't have to be alcoholic, but it'd be preferred. So, and I'm going to stop actually. If anyone wants to go get a drink, I'll take a little break. Everyone good? All right. Okay. All right. So if everyone could sort of lift their glasses, and we'll say cheers or salute or l'chaim.
Here. Salute.
Take a drink. Now, what neuroscience can tell us about what you just did? We know that as you were listening to me and then planning to pick up that glass or cup, a part of the brain called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that's right over here, was active. And that was very much in sort of the willingness or the volition to pick up the glass. As you were sort of trying to integrate the complex sensations, the coldness, and get your hands around it, an area of your brain called the premotor cortex was active. That's a little bit farther back. And also, as you may be looking around, as you were looking at me, as I picked up my glass, your premotor cortex was actually also active with these things called mirror neurons. And as you watched me pick up my glass, the same areas of your brain that were responsible for picking up a glass were registering. And mirror neurons are a real sort of hot topic and go into can go into sort of our understanding of empathy as well, that our brains register what other people are doing all the time. And finally, as you gathering up sort of the energy and the motivation, and finally the execution of the movement, brain structures much deeper in your brain, the one called the basal ganglia, was started firing, and that's what actually allows you to pick up your glass, bring it to your mouth, and swallow. And these are all things that neuroscientists can tell you, because we can do experiments, we can look at the brain, we can put electrodes on your head, we can also, either people who have accidents or missing brain regions, we start to learn about what they can and can't do. And we can also use tools besides scanners. We can also use pharmacological tools, such as giving people certain drugs, certain blockers, and see what they do, and then we learn about what that chemical in the brain in turn does. So now whatever was in that drink is starting to make its way down to your intestines, and it's going to be absorbed into the bloodstream and go up into your brain, and you might be starting to feel the beginnings of what would be a buzz. And we, through once again all these experiments that we can do as neuroscientists in sort of probing these receptors through brain scans, as well as blocking the receptors through giving people drugs, we know that the buzz that you experience, be it through a caffeinated beverage or an alcoholic beverage, is very much mediated by chemicals in the brain such as dopamine, GABA, and beta endorphin. Beta endorphin is obviously your brain's natural opiate. And then one of the really cool things that neuroscience is starting to do, and neuroscientists are starting to put a lot of energy in, is this genetic thing, and genes. And we're getting to the point where we can start to tell you that maybe you're one of these people that when you take a drink of an alcoholic beverage, you just get a lot of pleasure from it, and you want to keep drinking again and again. And we might be able to tell you that you have a certain mutation in one of your dopamine receptor genes. Now, this part of neuroscience is still really, we're far off from where we're going to be able to apply it clinically, but it's a hot topic right now in identifying the different mutations that are within the population and how they relate to behavior. But the thing is, all these things that I just told you that neuroscience can do, these are really considered, even though they took a lot of work on the part of neuroscientists to figure out, they're considered easy problems. In that, all we're doing with this, we're looking at what brain regions and what type of brain activity correlates with certain experiences. So we can put this Buddhist monk into a scanner. We can have them meditate, and then we can look at what happens to his brain. And we see all this neat stuff, all these neat colors happen that are signifying brain activity in certain regions. And we're able to correlate, and we're able to say, oh, meditation has to do with, oh, this part of the brain right here, this prefrontal cortex. That's really neat. But in the end, we're simply correlating. We're correlating brain activity. We can also do things like what certain neuroactivity is needed for certain experiences. We know when we give people a drug called naltrexone, which blocks opiate receptors, that is going to prevent the high of heroin. So we give it to heroin abusers, and that to help them keep sober. And so besides correlation and sort of this what's needed, that's what neuroscientists do, and it's very important information, but it's not the hard problem. And the hard problem is really, how does neural activity produce experience? How is it that our thoughts and our feelings and the experience of being me and you really emerges from all these things like neurons firing and receptor interactions and genes being transcribed? Now, we don't have that critical gap between the neuron and subjective experience, an experience of being human. Something has to, we don't know how that really emerges. How does it really translate? How does one translate into the other? And neuroscientists are not very good at this, and like I said, a lot of them really aren't even interested in trying, at least right now, but we're getting closer. But with that said, I'm really going to be talking about easy answers. And even though we're doing difficult problems that we're going to discuss today. These are all going to be things that neuroscience has done, and it's really these easy questions. So, getting started with that, we're going to start off with the neuroscience of consciousness in the self. And the reason I include these two together is because they're very much related. And we see that they're related when we look at how three neuroscientists who are well regarded in this field, how they conceptualize what it means to be conscious. So one guy, this guy Jaak Panksepp, he says that consciousness is the ineffable feeling of experiencing oneself as an active agent in the perceived events of the world. Can we digest that for a minute? It's pretty powerful, huh? Now, and then these other guys, Mark Solms and Oliver Turnbull, they have this sentence that I really like, that being conscious is very much the ability to say, this is me, I am this body, this is what I'm feeling. And they emphasize that consciousness is very much introspective, it's subjective, it's what sort of goes on in our mind's eye, for lack of a better phrase, and it's very much evaluative. And anything that's evaluative, anytime we evaluate something, it's going to have feeling attached to it. And so you can't separate consciousness from emotion. And that emotion is very much going to be involved in what it means to be conscious. And that latter part about the importance of emotion, that was taken from like the big guy in consciousness research, this guy Antonio Damasio. And he very much says that besides the importance of emotion, that consciousness is very much this interface between the current state of the self. So we're constantly evaluating how we're doing, what's going on in the body, what's going on in our thoughts. And it's coupling that with what's going on in this perceived world, in the object world. So it's this interface between two things. And so consciousness would be very much this ability to say, I'm feeling really hungry, or I'm feeling really thirsty. And the ability to integrate that with things that I perceive, that here's my glass of water. And obviously, when you think about consciousness like that, it has a lot of benefits. To be able to constantly integrate the status of the self with the status of what's going on. And there's also something called extended consciousness that he makes reference to, and that's that not only do we have the ability to monitor how we're doing in the current state of things, but also we can go back in time. We can say, this was how I was, last year when this happened, or I'm sort of having deja vu, and this sort of seems like something I experienced already before. And extended consciousness is very much the ability to utilize memory and higher functions that humans are known for. Now, when we actually talk about the brain regions that are involved in consciousness, we have to start with something called the extended reticular and thalamic activating system. And this is something, it's a mouthful. It's something that's sort of in the lower part of our brain, the very primitive part of our brain that all species, I should say most species have. Guess you could answer that better, Jake.
Species that have brains, yeah.
The species that have brains are going to have an extended thalamic reticular activating system. And we know that this is very much the core of consciousness. And we know this from, the way we know this is very unfortunate, because we know this basically from people who have had severe motor vehicle accidents. And when this part of the brain is damaged, yes, they can breathe, but we don't consider them awake. We don't see brain activity in the rest of their brain. and they don't seem to be that active agent in the perceived events of the world. So this is the region of the brain that really drives and energizes everything else. This is where all the neurochemicals that I talked about before are being spewed from into the rest of the brain. And it drives this cortical region. So if we don't have this ERATS, we don't have attention or emotion or motivation. Now, the second neat part of consciousness, besides this real, the driver, the mover, is something called the default mode network. And this was discovered once we started getting really into scanning people's brains. And we noticed that there was a very similar pattern going on within people when they were just at rest, when they weren't focused on doing anything. They seemed to have a similar pattern of brain activity. And the default mode network, so it's your brain on nothing, you're doing nothing. You're not focused on any sort of task, you're not trying to do anything. You might be daydreaming, you might be thinking, you're just sort of going about your business. And it's been conceptualized as this is our internal narrative, sort of, I don't know, when we're just sort of talking to ourselves, or it's also been conceptualized as the Freudian ego. And we'll get more to that later. And this is sort of just when we're mentalizing, daydreaming, or the autobiographical self. And there's a couple brain regions that are active in the default mode network. One is called the prefrontal cortex, and that's related to another region called the posterior cingulate cortex. And these are very much related to the regulation of other brain regions, as well as regulating other parts of the body. And they're also involved in what's called theory of mind, which is the ability to sort of think that, the ability to say, you know what, I have these thoughts, and these thoughts that I have right now, or these feelings, are going to be different than Steve's because I'm in a different position than Steve. So it's sort of like empathy, but it's sort of like the ability to realize that I'm not Steve, and Steve's in a different, he's sitting over there, so he's experiencing different things than I am. And also it's responsible for the integration of facts, as well as other types of perceptions. And then also you see the medial temporal lobe is active in this default mode network. So you have memory. And so it's almost like we're able to integrate and regulate all these things, and we're able to connect it to memory. And that's what's basically going on in our brain when we're just like lying awake at night. I think would be a good example of when your default mode network would be active.
Andy?
Yes?
Is there a lot of variance in this?
It's a great question. So there is variance in it. And you're going to see the most variance in it when you talk about people who have psychopathology. That someone with schizophrenia or someone with attention deficit disorder is going to have a different default mode network than someone who doesn't have psychopathology. But when you're talking about the normal population, obviously there's going to be variance, but it does have like this very well-defined pattern. Yeah. I should have mentioned that I really love interruption and questions.
I love interrupting.
It's part of his default.
Keep on. All right. So as a part of the default mode network, there is within it there's something called the cortical midline structures. And what's really interesting about the cortical midline structures is that these are active whenever we're thinking about our own personality traits, if we're thinking about information that we've come across, or we've come to like the conclusion of that we've worked out in our head, it's going to be activated when we're thinking about us versus another person. It's going to become active when we're thinking about our own judgments, or looking at our own face, thinking about our own feelings, and our own decisions. Basically, this is the self network. Everything about when all these studies that have been done that have to do with called self-referential processing seems to activate these regions of the brain. And they form this nice little line down the center. If you cut your brain in half, you would see all of them on the side. And that's what's called the cortical midline structures. So, and one thing about the cortical midline structures, particularly those ones that I have, that I'm pointing to, or that my computer is pointing to, is that they can do something called top-down processing, which essentially means that these are more, I guess, higher order than brain regions that are more evolved in humans as well as primates compared to lower animals, and they can have influenced lower brain regions. And this gives rise to a very important concept called downward causation. And downward causation is almost like the ability to have, well, one example of downward causation is the ability of like sort of effortful thinking or attention to regulate things like feeling, things like even like bodily processes. When you see those, when you are, that you could even say like saying, you know what, I'm not going to go to the bathroom now. I'm going to hold it. That would be downward causation. But I was also thinking of when you see, you hear about these monks who are able to maintain their body temperature, like way up in the Himalayas. That would be downward causation. They are using higher order brain regions to influence lower order brain regions. So one of the examples is that this prefrontal cortex, it can do cognitive modulation of pain perception. So suppressing pain, it's not something that's easy, but it's possible. If you really prepare yourself for a painful stimulus, you can sort of get ready for it, and it's not going to hurt as bad. We know that our prefrontal cortex is going to be involved with that. It's going to be involved. Have you guys heard of biofeedback? It's sort of right that when you hook yourself up to sort of either like a thermometer that measures your skin temperature, or a blood pressure machine, or a heart rate machine, and you learn like what you have to do to make your heart rate go down, or like sort of how you have to relax, and sort of this effortful manipulation of these bodily processes is very much regulated by this prefrontal cortex. And a beautiful example of how downward causation occurs was this study in 2004 that looked at the difference in brain activity between people who received something called cognitive behavioral therapy. These were depressed patients. Cognitive behavioral therapy, and people who were given a standard drug. In this case, it was Paxil. And what they found was that the people who got the cognitive behavioral therapy, they had changes in activity in this prefrontal cortex. The people who got the drugs, they had changes in activity in the subcortical regions. But they were all changing activity in the hippocampus, which is sort of this common region of the brain that we know is involved in depression. And so you can think of it as therapy and learning how to sort of like know what our triggers are for depressed mood, and really doing these cognitive exercises and these cognitive exercises and learning how to regulate our response to things and our emotions. That's downward causation. But at the same time, when we just take a drug, we're doing upward causation. We're affecting these lower brain regions to then affect other regions that are going to be more involved in mood and cognition. So does that make sense to everyone? Does everyone find that as neat as I did?
So are you sort of saying it's possible for me to think my way into the same thing I can do by taking a drug?
Yes, and I meant to actually make a word of caution. So, yes.
Did I just stumble into the caution?
Yeah, you stumbled into
Perfect.
it. Yeah. So I think when lots of people hear about this downward causation, like it's natural to jump to this conclusion that, whoa, we're superhumans, like we can think and make anything happen. And
Yes.
if I think it, and yeah, if I'm in pain, if I'm sad, if I'm depressed, like I just gotta think my way out of it. And that is what this suggests to an extent, but we have to look at the reality. So let's look at the Buddhist monks who are like the masters of downward causation. They spend their entire lives practicing how to do this, day in and day out. Then we look at what happened in this study right here. These people were in cognitive behavioral therapy with trained therapists for 6 weeks at least. So yes, like the idea that we can think ourselves out of negative emotions or just affect our body through our cognitive powers. It is possible, but you're really not going to see very significant changes unless you're putting a lot of energy into it. Say being in therapy or going to a monastery and working on meditation. Does that sort of get it?
Yeah, but I'm still looking at the bright side here, so it is possible.
It is possible. It is possible. Yeah, and right, and this goes, and the fact that like these people after therapy were able to have these changes, or the Buddhist monks, it speaks to the idea that like this mind is muscle sort of idea. That the more we use it, the more we practice using our effortful control over things, the better we're going to get. So yeah, no, I definitely encourage people to take up things like biofeedback and meditation. I think that this stuff has very much long-term benefits.
It isn't kind of some of the work with Daniel Siegel along this same, but rather than being totally introspective, it's interactional.
Right. Yeah. No. Daniel Siegel. I'm so glad someone brought up Daniel Siegel. Daniel Siegel. He wrote. What did he write? Like mindfulness, the mindful brain. Yeah, and then he has another one out called like the mindful therapist. And so his idea is very much similar to this. And he integrates it more with this idea that that in our interactions, with other people, we're very much regulating one another, and that's actually, and he takes a lot of that from actually psychoanalysis, that regulation with one another that is sort of, that starts with a mother and his child and goes on from there. Did I explain it? Did I explain it well? That interaction, like interpersonal interaction, how that can act as sort of this downward causation effect.
Yeah.
Okay.
In my mind, yeah, and that to me spoke pretty directly to what he was doing in the mindful brain in particular in the act of child rearing.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah.
That the child begins to master a particular set or lifestyle, like problem solving, as a function of those interactions, and it's active. It's an active process. Yes.
It's a very active process. Yeah, and the way that interpersonal sort of regulation works is really fascinating. It's actually one of my interests, and it's sort of amazing that in humans, it's sort of the mother's ability to be able to recognize that, a baby, to be able to look at her baby and say, oh, you're crying, your diaper must be wet, and to be able to sort of mimic and mirror what the baby must be feeling is very much tied to the baby's eventual ability to recognize its own emotions and to be able to regulate them. Not only to say,
would you say that again? I'm not sure I followed you. A mother? Would you say it again?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
It's not I'm denying it. I'm just blown away by it.
Right. So what happens is essentially that, okay, so a mother looks at a child, a crying child, it basically says, you know, doesn't her mother, he's like, oh, you're so sad, you're broken up because like, oh, your diapers wet, oh, you poor baby, and does this whole mimicking thing, and that allows the child to sort of recognize that it has emotions, and two, that by showing those emotions, eventually things are going to be okay in the end, and so it learns regulation, and that's the theory about what happens in terms of interactional downward causation. Yeah, and you can take downward causation to whole other levels, like that downward causation doesn't have to do with one brain region to the next. People talk about cultural downward causation, that our culture eventually affects our prefrontal cortex, which eventually affects everything about us. So it's a hot area. But yeah, sort of moving on, just a summary of consciousness and the self. That we know that we have these regions that are involved. One is this extended reticular thalamic activating system, and also our cortical midline structures. And these give us our sense of awareness, our sense of awakeness, sort of our energy. They allow us to both evaluate ourselves and the outside world and interact with it. It gives us a distinct self that's able to differentiate ourself from another, as well as ourself from other objects, any type of other objects. And we know that it has influences over our thoughts, over our feelings, and even our bodily processes. So a big question here is this mind? Is this soul? You know, what's going on here? Is consciousness as described by these brain functions? Is this what we consider our definition of things that are non-material, like mind and soul? So that's just something to think about. All right. And so now I'm going to get into a little bit of the neuroscience of religious experience. And the first thing I wanted to tackle is this idea, is there a God spot in the brain? Is there a part of the brain that's responsible for interaction with the divine? And a lot of people sort of got this idea that there's a spot for anything in the brain from a neuroscientist named Wilder Penfield. And Penfield is a very famous neuroscientist who he was a neurosurgeon and neurologist who did these experiments in which he would have a person's brain open before he was operating them, and he would stimulate with electricity different parts of the brain. And he did this because he needed to know which parts of the brain that he needed to cut off, because these were epileptic patients, and he was trying to prevent them from having future seizures. But what he was finding is that when he would stimulate, in particular one region of the brain called the temporal lobe, some people were having these really crazy experiences that were very spiritual in nature, and were very vivid, and even had hallucinations. And this sort of and so some people took this to mean like, wow, like this is the God spot. But when we look at it a little further, you know, a lot of people didn't have spiritual experiences. Some people just had really vivid memories of their childhood. Some people had just sort of, you know, run-of-the-mill experiences, or experiences, and it didn't occur in every patient. And probably the biggest problem, we really haven't been able to replicate it too. So I did just want to share these two pictures.
Could you tell us what spiritual was or is in that context?
Yeah, so, and I think spiritual, as I remember reading it, it was that the people sensed a divine presence, and a sense of sort of oneness with this divine presence.
Did it vary between people who aren't so religious?
Yeah, and I can't tell you that, but I think yeah, it raises all these questions about that. I don't think they really looked back at the people they were doing it with. But yeah, that's all the stuff that comes up. Is who were these people who were having the spiritual experiences versus the not so spiritual experiences. And we're going to talk about that as well as some other stuff. But yeah, this is just me at the Montreal Neurological Institute, which is where Wilder Penfield did all of his studies. And so there was this thing on the outside. The problem of neurology is the problem of man himself, which I just thought was so profound. And that's pondering the problem of man. But anyway, so there are a lot of, well, not a lot. I'd say, I don't know how many. Probably about 5 or 6 really good studies on neuroimaging of religious experience, and it's not, and it varies. A lot of it's meditation in monks. Some of it is Franciscan nuns. Some of it's people, self-identified religious people who are repeating a psalm in their head. And so, but when you look at all these studies together, you do start to see a little bit of a pattern. There's activation of the prefrontal cortex. That was the thing that we were talking about that's for sort of downward causation. But it's also, it also has selective attention and affect regulation, so regulation of mood. We see activation of the temporal cortex, which are memories, life events, dreaming, even hallucinations. And then there's deactivation of this region of the parietal cortex, which is on my top. And what's really interesting is that this region of the brain is involved with knowing, with sensing ourselves in 3D space, sort of knowing where we are in the material world. And that region of the brain is being deactivated in a lot of these studies that are talking about religious experience. And so, from this information, two of the guys who are really into this, Newberg and, can someone pronounce that other name for me? Tigwili? No?
No.
Okay. All right. They came up with a model of religious experience, of this neuroscientific account of religious experience, of what's going on. And it's based on basically their 2 studies. One was on Tibetan monks meditating, and the other one was on Franciscan monks praying. And what they thought was going on is that there's a fixation on religious imagery. The monks were very much visualizing something. The nuns were, I think, saying a specific prayer, I forgot what. This leads to stimulation of our limbic centers, our emotional centers that are responsible for pleasure, as well as being alert. And that leads to this bottom-up feedback into the prefrontal cortex, and that just gets saturated with stimulation because they're doing very intense meditation and praying. And because of that, that ends up blocking this region that we were talking about back here. That's responsible for the self in 3D space. And that leads to this obliteration almost of our self-other boundary. And we then get this sense of oneness with the universe, which is very much a part of this religious experience. And let me actually go back, because I do have a definition of religious experience by one of the people who did this reviews. Very moment of experience of ultimate divine reality or ultimate divine truth, a transcendence of events or universe, timelessness, spacelessness, and divine being, and or union with it in any combination with an accompanying memorable feeling of reality, emotions, and thoughts within a religious context. So that's how they describe it. And I admit that this doesn't really make sense to me. And I mean, I haven't read too in depth to it, but just this idea that it's definitely possible for one region of the brain to sort of, it's called deafferentation, to sort of almost like shut off another region of the brain. But just the overall order of events that they're talking about, like I said, I'm no expert, but it didn't click with me for some reason. What did click with me is that this sense of oneness, and that getting rid of sort of, or deactivating some of these regions that are responsible for self might be a big key part of what it is to have an intense spiritual, mystical, religious experience. And I know we're throwing around a lot of words there, and it's going to, and unfortunately the literature doesn't really differentiate between the three all the time.
This actually seems counterintuitive to what I was expecting. I mean,
yeah, go for it.
The opposite of what I was expecting. Because I think of the prefrontal cortex, of the part that says, I'm going to take control of my brain. And I think about meditation, and the meditation techniques that I've been taught at least, is to say, when you take, your job is to remove thought from your brain, to not have thought, to kind of, and I sort of think of that as like disabling my efforts to control my brain, and letting my brain go. And when I notice my brain starting to take me in one direction, I need to shut that off. So what Newberg and Keeley's research is suggesting is just the opposite, that you need to take full control of your brain to have this sense of oneness.
So, yeah, and so that's a really good point. And what that actually goes on is that there's multiple regions of the prefrontal cortex. And the two that are most relevant are one called the medial prefrontal cortex, which is very much going to be related to this sort of sense of control and regulation and these things that we think about. And I guess the things that you were sort of not letting go. While there's a part called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which I was talking about earlier, and that's very much when we focus on things outside of ourselves. And so while they don't differentiate in these studies between the difference, we do know that when we go from a mode of thinking about ourselves to thinking about something else, i.e. focusing on our breathing. Well, that's not a very good example.
Well, that is a good example.
Focusing on our breathing, or focusing on an image, focusing on reading something, we switch from the medial prefrontal cortex to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So that's, but yeah, it raises these issues because we talk about the prefrontal cortex and we ascribe to all these different things, but the truth is that there is so many different functions and so many different regions that have various functions, different functions.
Although the idea of the obliteration of the self in any of the major traditions, that sense of taking the boundary out, communion, is getting rid of the connection between you and the divine, right? That's sort of the basic definition of what the mystics are after, is some kind of this eternal communion by taking out the barrier that separates the you with the divine, or like in Hindu or Buddhism, the idea of getting, I mean, there is that oneness that comes, that sounds, I mean, it seems to, those connect very well with sort of the basic definitions of a lot of the mystical traditions in all religions.
Yeah. Actually, I forgot what movie it was, but it was like with Richard Gere and Kabbalah. Did that ring any bells for anyone? No? but I remember like a lot of it was like, yeah, this all of a sudden, you know, I guess I thought of that what they were going for is all of a sudden this obliteration of self and sort of communion with something outside of the self, and it very much, the mystics, yeah, good.
I just read something recently about a prisoner of war that had been kept in confinement in a particular environment for many years. Now these monks and meditations and everything, they're trying to get somewhere. Okay, clearing their mind, trying to achieve a level of something. They're making a conscious effort. Now this prisoner of war was kept in a completely white room with bright lights for years. What does that do? He wasn't trying. He didn't have a lot of stimulus.
Yeah.
So he probably, the trouble with monks and people who meditate is meditate for an hour or 2 hours, or monks, they can do it for days, weeks at a time. But eventually they stop and have other stimuli. They've got to come down.
Right.
This prisoner didn't have an opportunity to come down.
Yeah.
He may have been able to achieve what these guys have been trying years for and didn't want to achieve it. I mean, he was trying to keep from losing his mind.
No, that's an excellent point. And you guys have heard of Timothy Leary and Richard Albert, and the experiments they did were sensory deprivation. And that's how they got people to achieve really mystical, crazy states.
But wasn't that through pharmacology?
It was with and without pharmacology. And so you could go into the deprivation chamber, and if you were there long enough, you were going to start hallucinating. And that's just how it is. And we're going to talk about that. There's multiple ways to get to this obliteration of self, and there's multiple ways to obliterate parts of the brain that are self. And that raises all this question about, well, what is a spiritual experience, and how does it differ from something like sensory deprivation? And that actually, right, okay. All right, and so, is inhibition of self and other parietal region that we were talking about, is that sufficient to produce a spiritual experience? And the answer is probably no, because we see patients with Alzheimer's disease all the time who often sometimes have selective disruption of that particular area of the brain. And while some of them do start having become more spiritual in nature, or possibly have more spiritual experiences, a lot of them don't. And so this doesn't seem to be the end-all be-all of achieving a sense of oneness, is to get this area, this particular area of the brain knocked out. And so the question is, are there other areas of the brain regions that would be possible to blur our sense of self and lead to this sense of oneness? And this is where we get some insights from both Freud and magic mushrooms. And yeah, we're going to get, and this is also where the sensory deprivation, and like someone who would be subjected to prolonged periods without any type of stimuli, where that would come in as well. So the Freudian ego, and I brought this in mainly because this is one of my own interests, and this is very much how I see the psychic apparatus that I'm involved with, an area called neuropsychoanalysis, and it's very much looking at sort of the Freudian model and relating it to neuroscience. So just to disclose where I'm coming from, I guess, that the Freudian ego, so it's responsible for our conscious sense of self, the cohesion of the self. It represses our drives, and as well as our impulses. So a lot of the same things that we were talking about earlier with this downward causation, the conscious parts of the brain, the default mode network. And right, it's the same thing. And it's also, and when we engage in object/goal-oriented cognition, it switches off regions of the ego. This is what I was talking about earlier. So we go from the medial prefrontal cortex, which is our ego, to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is sort of our focus on something else, or our engagement in the outside world, or in the internal world, such as like focus on the breath, or something like that. And so we can say this is to switch modes, to go from the ego to the object-seeking mode. That's almost what we see as losing oneself in activity, to sort of obliterate your ego. And we see that all the time. People get involved in things, whether it's dancing or even those very rare occasions that I might be working on something that I really love. When time just seems to fly by. That's sort of when your object-seeking mode is maximally engaged, and your ego or self brain regions are very much turned off. And so then now we go into magic mushrooms or psilocybin. And so we know that these were used throughout history to achieve more mystical states. And just in a recent study they did, they showed that when they gave it to people in a lab, a lot of them had these wonderful spiritual experiences that even lasted 14 months afterwards. Not the actual state, but the positive, what they got out of it, the insight they developed and stuff like that. That would be sort of a nightmare if it lasted that long. And what you see when you give someone this psilocybin, these mushrooms, and you put them in a scanner, you get this decrease in activity in these self networks, particularly the medial prefrontal cortex. And right, it goes through, and those decreases are going to be correlated with the subjective effects that you get from the mushrooms. And that happens through serotonin. But so the neuroscience of religious experience, to sum it up, we have a blurring of the self, probably achieving a sense of oneness. And it may occur through decreased activity in any one of these regions that's responsible for the self. It could be in that sort of primary area of these medial prefrontal cortex. It could be more the sensory sense of self back here that's more like the sense of this health and space. But something usually happens, one of these regions probably has to get turned off. And that leads to this feeling of oneness, likely. But what's still unanswered to me is, where do we get this sense of the divine presence? And is that going to be mediated, like you said, depending upon the person? Does a sort of a person need to be religious to begin with, when one of these regions are taken off, or when they eat mushrooms, or when they're engaged in meditation, to sense a divine presence on top of this feeling of oneness? Is that just going to depend on the person? Or is that more of a specific brain region in general that's being engaged? And what's the difference between having a religious or spiritual experience and very much this engagement, this intense engagement in more everyday activities that we have? I don't know, has anyone read the books like Flow? Okay, all right. So flow is basically the sense of that getting so involved in something that we lose sense of time, and it usually only happens when we're doing something that we really love, but flow could very much be related to sort of, I guess, this experience that I'm talking about here, that when you have this obliteration of the self and you're turning on that dorsolateral, that object-seeking network in the brain. So my overall summary, neuroscience knows some of the brain regions that are involved in consciousness. We know some of the brain regions that mediate our sense of self. And we know that probably to have a religious experience, you probably need to have a decrease in these regions. that mediate the sense of self. But, of course, we still have these hard questions left. Yeah, that's my German Shepherd Waldo doing his confused head tilt. And sort of what I asked earlier, do these consciousness mediating regions, does that constitute a mind or a soul, or is it related to what those things might mean? And how do we even begin to close this gap from this thing in our head that's firing and has chemical interactions to what we actually experience? And so with that, I mean, I don't know, let's talk.
Yep. Great. Do we have some questions right off the bat for Andy while he's still standing up here? Or are we ready for that? Okay, then maybe not immediately, but